Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, allow me this morning to welcome you all to the release of the preliminary statements from 4 international observer missions to the 2024 National Assembly elections in the Republic of Mauritius. Allow me to recognize the Honorable Muhammad Chande Othman, the head of the SADC Electoral Observation Mission and former Chief Justice of the United Republic of Tanzania. Let me also recognize Her Honor, Dr. Joyce Mujuru, the head of the African Union Electoral Observation Mission, who is also the former Vice President of the Republic of Zimbabwe. Let me recognize Your Excellency, Mr. Elias Mahosi, the SADC Executive Secretary. Allow me also to recognize Honorable Nikolai Popescu, the head of mission of the Francophone Electoral Observer Mission and former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Moldova. Let me also, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, recognize Bishop Sipo Tembe, head of the Electoral Commission's Forum for SADC countries and Vice Chairperson of the Elections and Boundaries Commission of the Kingdom of Eswatini. Your Excellencies, allow me also to recognize the United Nations resident representative present here, all members of the diplomatic corps present, the Director of the SADC Organ on Politics, Defense and Security Affairs, Professor Kula Ishmael, senior government officials present, distinguished members of the SADC Troika of the Organ on Politics, Defense and Security Cooperation. These are from the republics of Malawi, Zambia, and the United Republic of Tanzania. And all senior officials, representatives of the Office of the Election Commissioner here in the Republic of Mauritius, members of the SADC Election Advisory Council, SIAC, ambassadors representing SADC countries here in the Republic of Mauritius, and all delegates, representatives of the political parties, members of the civil society organizations, and colleagues from the media. My name is Innocent Mvundwa. I'm the Communications and Relations Officer from the SADC Secretariat. And this morning, I'm honored to direct the proceedings of the release of the statements from the 4 international observer missions present here. Your Excellencies, our program is going to be as follows. We are going to have statements from the SADC Electoral Observation Mission. Then there will be another statement from the African Union Electoral Observation Mission. And the third presentation is going to be made by the Francophone Electoral Observer Mission. And the last presentation is going to come from the Electoral Commission's Forum for SADC countries. At the end of the 4 presentations, we are going to offer an opportunity to the members of the media and also stakeholders present to pose some questions if they've got any questions to ask to the heads of missions. At the end of that, we're going to have some refreshments, and that will be the end of our function this morning. Without taking much of your time, Your Excellencies, allow me at this juncture to invite the Honorable Muhammad Chande Othman, the head of the SADC Electoral Observation Mission and former Chief Justice of the United Republic of Tanzania, to come to the podium to deliver his preliminary statement. Yes.
heads of electoral observer missions, Your Excellencies, head and representatives of diplomatic corps accredited to the Republic of Mauritius and the UN resident coordinator. I think in the interest of time, I will just say and write on the order presented by Master of Ceremonies and say all protocols observed and good morning, bonjour. I think on behalf of the Southern Africa Development Community and as mandated by Her Excellency Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, the President of the United Republic of Tanzania and Chairperson of the SADC organ on Politics, Defense and Security Cooperation, it is my distinguished honor to welcome you all to this important event where I will be presenting the preliminary statement of the SADC Electoral Observation Mission on the 2024 National Assembly elections held on 10th of November 2024 in the Republic of Mauritius. As head of the SIOM, I'm well supported by representatives from Tanzania, the United Republic, the Republics of Malawi and Zambia as members of the SADC organ Troika. Our mission was also advised by two members from the SADC Electoral Advisory Council. SIOM comprised 35 observers from 9 SADC member states, namely the Kingdom of Eswatini, the Republics of Botswana, Namibia, Malawi, Mozambique, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and the United Republic of Tanzania. These observers were deployed in all 10 administrative districts of Mauritius, namely Black River, Flag, Grand Port, Mocha, Pamplemousse, Plan Willem, Port Louis, Rivière des Ramparts, Savane, and Rodrigues. At the invitation of the government of the Republic of Mauritius, the mission observed the National Assembly elections in accordance with revised SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections 2021 and the relevant laws of Mauritius. As part of its mandate, the mission engaged key stakeholders in the Republic of Mauritius, including electoral management bodies, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Regional Integration and International Trade, the Attorney General, political parties, civil society organizations, academia, SADC ambassadors and high commissioners, and other members of diplomatic corps accredited to Mauritius, the Mauritius Police Force, and the Council of Religious Leaders, and last but not least, the media. This preliminary report covers the mission's observations of the pre-election process, election day, and counting. The final report will cover our observations of the post-election process, including the results management and announcement. This is the summary of our findings on the political and security environment. The mission observed that the country was calm and peaceful during the pre-election, election day, and the counting, which attests to the peaceful nature of Mauritians. The mission further observed no major incidents or threat of violence during this election cycle. I therefore wish to use this opportunity to commend the people of Mauritius for their peaceful conduct, which contributed to the conducive electoral environment. The mission noted the stakeholders' satisfaction with the police presence across the constituencies, increased security detail in the form of patrols following nomination day, and the advanced training and planning for deploying officers to various polling stations. In pursuit of maintaining law and order during the election, the mission noted that a police communique was issued prohibiting the sale of alcohol on the day preceding the elections, on polling day, and the day after the election. The Mauritius police force maintained vigilance and preserved the peace by providing the necessary security to all stakeholders during the pre-election, election day, and counting day, ensuring, once again, a conducive electoral environment. On the management of the electoral process. The elections were overseen by the electoral management bodies established under Chapter 5 of the Constitution of the Republic of Mauritius. In this regard, the mission observed the following: the general confidence and trust among stakeholders in the Electoral Commission's office. 2, voter registration was generally well conducted in the 2 rounds of voter registration exercised by the Office of the Electoral Commissioner. The first round was conducted between January and February 2024 and involved house-to-house inquiries to verify the presence or existence of each voter for purposes of voter registration. Around 2,649 personnel were engaged to embark on this exercise. The second round was conducted at regional centers between 16th and 30th of May 2024. Thirdly, the mission noted concerns over alleged discrepancies in the voter register. Some stakeholders alleged that the register of electors still contained names not in the country, of persons not in the country, and those who were known to be deceased. They feared that such names could create an atmosphere for rigging election. Against this background, the Office of the Electoral Commissioner assured the mission that the electors' register was updated through door-to-door inquiries to confirm the physical presence of electors eligible for registration. And in addition, the discrepancies might arise as a result of electors leaving the country after registering. Fourthly, out of a total population of 1,261,196,000 people of 2022 census, the mission observed that the Office of Electoral Commissioner registered 1,002,857 voters, which is 79.5% of the population, of which 51% of these represent women voters, while for male voters, the percentage was 48.7%. Fifthly, the mission noted concerns from a few stakeholders on proxy voting, noting that this could be perceived as creating an opportunity for electoral mispractices. Sixthly, the mission noted concerns from stakeholders that the counting of votes was still conducted on polling day at polling stations. While some stakeholders claimed that this presented an opportunity for election rigging, others supported counting votes on a day when electoral officers are not exhausted. Some stakeholders recommended that this could be avoided if information, communication, and technology could be adopted. They further argued that the counting of votes on the same day as voting presents practical and financial challenges, and this would require more human resources. Some stakeholders informed the mission that this issue had been the subject of protected debate, but there had not been any consensus in this respect. 7, the mission was informed that there had not been any electoral law reforms since the last election in 2019. In the same vein, there were no pending electoral petitions and litigation before courts relating to this election. Some stakeholders acknowledged that the Office of the Electoral Commissioner had done its part in submitting its recommendation of electoral reforms to the government, which in turn submitted it to Parliament, but they were never approved. Some stakeholders attributed the delay in the approval of electoral reforms to a lack of voter education, weak and/or limited participation of civil society organizations, and the lack of political will. While noting that the existence of a clear mechanism for lodging electoral complaints and appeals, some stakeholders raised concern about the long turnaround time and the need to establish electoral courts that will focus only on electoral issues. And finally, the mission noted concerns from stakeholders of insufficient civic and voter education by the electoral management bodies. It was observed that there was inadequate election promotional material posted by the Electoral Commission of Mauritius, encouraging people to vote or educating them on the voting process. On gender and youth representation, the mission noted that while women accounted for 51.3% of registered voters, only 18%, that is 165 of 891 nominated candidates that contested for National Assembly positions are women. In this regard, there appears to have been insufficient efforts at national level and by political parties during this election to address this imbalance. According to the Electoral Commissioner, there were 73 political parties registered at the time of this election, and that only 29 of these fielded candidates. Out of 891 nominated candidates, 273 nominated candidates were under 40 years of age, while the rest were over 40 years. There appears to have been insufficient efforts by political parties during these elections to motivate women and youth participation in politics. Some stakeholders attributed this low participation of youth to their interest being more issue-based than party affiliation. On the role of the state-owned media and media in general, the mission noted that some stakeholders believed that state-owned media is relatively independent and provides coverage to all political parties. In contrast, others expressed concern over the limited coverage provided to what is perceived as smaller political parties and how decision-making in the private press influence their media coverage based on their party affiliation with very little objectivity. Some stakeholders informed the mission about a formula used to apportion airtime, which is only afforded to those who have fielded a minimum of 8 candidates. The formula is said to have been determined by an independent actuary expert who has considered the number of candidates fielded and the number of returned candidates of a particular party. Some stakeholders believe that political parties and candidates were aware of this formula and that the independent expert had conducted enough sensitization. To this end, no complaints have been received. Most stakeholders were concerned about the level of access to social media for 24 hours during the electoral period, which was temporarily shut down. The mission noted the clarification by the government of Mauritius that the temporary shutdown of social media was due to national security. While some stakeholders understood that restraining access to social media may be perceived at times as a necessary measure to stop disinformation, others believe that candidates and political parties need social media to organize, assemble, and communicate their electoral programs. It was their view that it is therefore imperative for voters to have access to information to enable them to make informed decisions. I now turn to observation on the election day. On polling day, SIOM observed the voting processes and the performance of the Office of the Electoral Commissioner in 180 polling stations in all 21 constituencies of the Republic of Mauritius. The SIOM observed the following in all the polling stations visited. The environment was calm and peaceful, and SADC observers were granted access. 99% of the polling stations and their surroundings were free of campaign material or visible campaign activities. All polling stations visited were adequately laid out with voters' roll displayed. 98% of the polling stations observed opened on time, while all closed on time. There were posters educating voters on the voting procedures posted outside 85% of the polling stations observed. Party agents and observers were present before, at the opening, and at the opening in all the polling stations visited. Ballot boxes were locked and sealed adequately before voting started. Voter identification documentation was checked against the voter's roll. 99% of the polling stations observed were accessible to all voters, including people with disabilities, the elderly, and pregnant women who were prioritized. At all the polling stations, voting proceeded without interruption. At 94% of the polling stations, all voters were allowed to vote, while at 6% of the polling stations, some voters were not allowed to vote due to the following three reasons: lack of appropriate national ID card, being at a wrong polling station, attempts to vote by proxy by Mauritians in the diaspora. No formal complaints were lodged in 96% of the polling stations visited. All polling stations that were visited had sufficient quantity of polling material and were free of irregularities. Party agents and candidates were allowed to follow closely procedures in all the polling stations observed, and reconciliation numbers were announced to all present in 79% of these polling stations. And finally, in all polling stations observed, the presiding officer reconciled the number of unused, used, and spoiled ballots at the end of the day, with the number of ballots received, while other sensitive material were packaged safely before handing it over to the returning officer. Then finally, recommended improvement in the electoral process. At this juncture, allow me to recall that SIOM is continuing the process of electoral observation in the post-election phase. As such, the mission will not provide comprehensive recommendation or qualification for the election at this juncture or at this stage. The mission presents the following recommendation for improvement by relevant authorities and stakeholders. The first two of which emanate from the 2019 report of SIOM to Mauritius. First is a concerted effort should be made to encourage women to stand as political candidates. Secondly, the counting of ballots at police station is in line with SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections. Those recommendations emanate, as I said, from the 2019 observation of the 2019 election in Mauritius. On the management of the election process, the Office of the Electoral Commissioner is urged to adopt information technology in the registration, capturing, management, and dissemination of electoral data and information to improve the efficiency of the electoral process. Technology can improve transparency of the election process and confidence in the management of the elections to enhance democracy in Mauritius. Secondly, the mission urges the government of Mauritius to consider or reconsider the possibility of amending the electoral laws to include the counting of votes and publication of provisional results at polling stations. And the mission recommends strengthening voter education in the country to ensure effective participation of the Mauritian electorate in the electoral process. In conclusion, SIOM observed that the pre-election and voting phases of the 2024 National Assembly elections were professionally organized and conducted orderly and peacefully, enabling voters to express their democratic will. The mission commends the people of Mauritius for political maturity, the spirit of tolerance and calmness that generally prevailed during this election period. The mission appeals to all contestants to channel their concerns, if any, through established legal procedures and processes in the event of any electoral dispute. Following the SADC principle and guidelines governing democratic elections 2021, our final report will be issued within 30 days of this preliminary statement. The SIAC shall return to Mauritius at the appropriate time to undertake a post-election review, again in accordance with SADC principles, to determine the extent to which the recommendations of SIOM have been implemented and the nature of support, if any, that the member state holding elections may require from SADC region to implement those proposals. I want to thank you very much. Muito obrigado. Merci beaucoup. Asanteni sana.
Thank you very much, Honorable Othman, head of the SADC Electoral Observation Mission, for your preliminary statement. And this statement, just for the colleagues from the media, is going to be shared in French, Portuguese, and other SADC languages. At this juncture, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, allow me to invite Her Honor, Dr. Joyce Mujuru, the head of the African Union Electoral Observer Mission. Honorable.
Thank you, our MC, Your Excellencies, heads of observer missions here represented. For the purpose of not leaving anyone out, let me recognize the good job of introductions done by our MC before, and just say to all of us here present, dignitaries, all protocols observed. The African Union Election Observer Mission was deployed from 4th of November to 14th of November 2024 to observe the 10th November National Assembly elections on the invitation of the government of the Republic of Mauritius and the office of the Electoral Commissioner of Mauritius. The mission was led by myself with people drawn from the 50 observers from Pan-African Parliament, the election management bodies, independent electoral academia, governance experts, and civil society organizations. And these also included 21 African Union member states. The objective of the mission is to assess the 2024 National Assembly elections in line with the relevant AU instruments, such as the 2002 African Guidelines for Election Observation and Monitoring Missions, the 2002 AU Declaration on Principles Governing Democratic Elections in Africa, the 1981 African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the 2007 African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, the regional and international instruments, and the legal framework for elections in the Republic of Mauritius. As part of its methodology, the mission engaged key electoral stakeholders, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the police, the Office of the Electoral Commissioner, representatives of the diplomatic corps, political parties, the media, CSOs, other observer missions, and academia. On election day, the mission deployed 15 teams of observers across 16 constituencies to observe key processes, including the final phases of the electoral campaigns and limited post-election activities. The teams visited a total of 191 polling centers where they observed the opening, voting, closing, and the counting procedures. This preliminary statement is based on the mission's findings during the pre-election period, the election day, and the immediate post-election phase. The mission is cognizant that the electoral process is ongoing and will continue to observe the remaining phases. A final report with comprehensive findings and recommendations will be issued a month after the elections. Preliminary findings. The mission makes the following preliminary observations. Based on its observation of the electoral process thus far, the mission summarized the following as constituting commendable practices. There was adequate number of polling staff for the National Assembly elections, and this ensured a smooth, efficient, and credible electoral process. The creation of special polling rooms with ramps for electors with special needs, the provision of hourly updates on the numbers of electors who had voted increased transparency. The discipline and respect by Mauritians towards the polling staff and the elderly during the voting exercise. The provision for parties and candidates to place their seals on the ballot boxes increased the trust of the electors. The friendly attitude by the polling staff towards electors and international observers. Efforts made to address election-related issues by establishing the inquiry units at every polling center. The high representation of women among polling staff and agents. The provision of a comprehensive electoral information pack to the observers. The nomination of 891 candidates for 21 constituencies was peaceful. Noting that the electoral processes are work in progress, we take note of areas where we think improvements may be needed. Legislative gaps. The mission is of the view that some gaps still exist in the legal framework, such as lack of affirmative action measures to ensure the equal participation of women, youths, and persons with disabilities in the political process. Limited time frame for electoral appeals. Lack of time frame for dispute resolutions. Uncertainty around the setting of election dates. Gender equality and inclusion in the electoral process. In Mauritius, women represent more than half of the population, that is 50.7%, and comprising of 51.3% of the electors. However, there were 165 female among the 891 candidates, constituting 18.52%. The mission notes that this is lower than the 50% gender representation prescribed by the AU Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa. The role of local observers. The mission notes that the role of citizens as local observers can increase the transparency of the electoral process. However, the mission did not observe the active participation of citizen observers. Counting of ballot boxes. The mission noted that counting of ballots did not take place at the polling centers on the day of voting, 10th November 2024. However, the mission further notes that counting took place the following day, 11 November 2024, at the designated counting centers in line with the electoral framework. This is not in line with international and regional standards on elections. As a mission, we offer the following preliminary recommendations. The mission reiterates its 2019 recommendation that the government should consider constitutional or legal quotas to increase the participation of women in line with the African Union Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa of 2003. Adopt the Political Parties Act to regulate the conduct of political parties before, during, and after elections. Ratify the African Charter for Democracy, Elections, and Governance. Strengthen the Political Party Finance Act to allow the monitoring of campaign funding to create a level playing field. Enact laws to provide for ballot counting at polling centers immediately after voting to uphold the principles of transparency and security of ballots. In conclusion, the mission concludes that the 2024 elections were conducted in compliance with the national laws. The elections were also largely in line with the regional, continental, and international standards and were therefore credible, transparent, and peaceful. The fuller version of the preliminary statement will be available in due course when it's expected. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Honor, Dr. Joyce Mujuru. the head of the African Union Electoral Observation Mission, and former Vice President of the Republic of Zimbabwe. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, allow me now to invite the Honorable Nikolai Popescu, Head of Mission of Francophone Electoral Observer Mission, who is also the former Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Moldova. Your Excellency, sir.
Thank you very much. Dear fellow heads of the election observation missions, dear Honorable Mohamed Chandi Othman, Joyce Mujuru, Bishop Sifo Tembe, it's a pleasure to share with you this panel and bring our contribution to the political life of democratic Mauritius. Dear fellow election observers, dear representatives of the media, of the diplomatic corps, and citizens and friends of Mauritius who have closely monitored these days, the developments in Mauritius, and this is, of course, always a very important moment in the life of every democracy when you hold elections. And this was a pleasure and an honor for me to represent the organization, International Organization for Francophonie, in helping and working together towards a stronger democracy in Mauritius. If you allow me, I will naturally speak to French from here onwards. Et je voudrais commencer par mentionner que c'est à l'invitation du commissaire électoral de Maurice que la secrétaire générale de la francophonie a dépêché une mission électorale de la francophonie à l'occasion des élections législatives du 10 novembre 2024 dans cet État membre de la francophonie, Maurice. Notre mission contient des représentants de 5 pays, de Moldova, Seychelles, Comores, Mauritanie, Madagascar et le secrétariat de l'organisation. Présente à Port-Louis depuis le 6 novembre 2024, la mission électorale de la francophonie s'est entretenue avec ses partenaires et les partenaires prenants au processus électoral. La mission électorale de la francophonie s'est attachée à évaluer, en application de son mandat et des dispositions de la déclaration de Bamako, la tenue des élections libres, fiables et transparentes, les conditions de préparation et de tenue des élections législatives à Maurice. Le jour du scrutin, les membres de notre mission ont suivi le déroulement du vote dans 15 circonscriptions électorales sur les 21 circonscriptions du pays. Ils ont aussi pu visiter une trentaine de centres de vote. Ainsi, sur la base de nos observations et les analyses et les entretiens qu'on a eus avec les organes et les acteurs du processus électoral, y compris la société civile, notre mission a établi les constats suivants. Les citoyens font confiance aux institutions chargées des élections et sont attachés au pluralisme politique, à la diversité des médias, héritée d'une longue tradition d'élections démocratiques dans le pays. Sur le plan juridique, le cadre législatif régissant le processus électoral est globalement suffisant pour la conduite des élections libres, fiables, transparentes et pacifiques. En outre, il est respecté par tous les acteurs concernés. Les listes électorales sont mises à jour sur une base annuelle au mois d'août de chaque année. L'enregistrement des candidats s'est déroulé sans incident. Néanmoins, la plupart des interlocuteurs de notre mission ont exprimé leurs préoccupations concernant une forte sous-représentation des femmes parmi les candidats. Le scrutin s'est déroulé au calme. Les forces de la police étaient présentes mais discrètes. Les matériels et documents électoraux étaient disponibles en quantité suffisante dans tous les centres de vote visités. Les isoloirs assuraient le secret de vote et les urnes étaient transparentes. Tous les centres de vote visités par notre mission étaient équipés d'un bureau aménagé pour faciliter le vote de personnes à mobilité réduite. Les femmes étaient fortement mobilisées comme électrices et membres du bureau et centre de vote. Les bureaux de vote ont ouvert et fermé aux heures légales. Les délégués des candidats étaient présents dans tous les bureaux de vote visités avec une forte représentation féminine. Cependant, des acteurs rencontrés ont souligné la nécessité de renforcer la confiance des citoyens dans les institutions électorales et de consolider certains aspects du processus électoral. Pour le faire, notre mission formule les recommandations suivantes. Assurer un meilleur encadrement du financement des partis politiques et des campagnes électorales afin de contribuer à une transparence accrue du processus électoral. Prévoir, comme pour les observateurs internationaux, une disposition juridique permettant aux organisations de la société civile de réaliser l'observation nationale des élections en vue de renforcer la transparence et la crédibilité des élections. Procéder, dès la fin du vote, aux opérations de dépouillement en présence des partis intéressés, à savoir les membres du bureau de vote, des délégués, des candidats, des observateurs. Un dépouillement le lendemain du scrutin peut altérer la confiance dans les résultats électoraux et la confiance des parties prenantes nationales. Garantir le fonctionnement régulier du réseau Internet. La campagne électorale était pluraliste et s'est déroulée dans le calme. Néanmoins, la désinformation sur les réseaux sociaux reste un sujet sensible au niveau politique et dans la société en général. Plus particulièrement, la campagne électorale a été marquée par la suspension temporaire des réseaux sociaux. La mission électorale de la francophonie réitère la disponibilité de l'Organisation internationale de la francophonie à accompagner les acteurs mauriciens dans leur effort en vue du renforcement de la paix et de la démocratie. La mission remercie les autorités et tous les Mauriciens pour l'accueil et l'hospitalité réservée aux membres de notre délégation, ainsi que nos partenaires de SADC, de l'Union africaine et du Forum des commissions électorales de SADC pour la bonne coopération pendant cette période électorale. Je vous remercie et félicitations pour ce scrutin.
Thank you very much, Head of Mission of the Francophone Electoral Observation Mission here in the Republic of Mauritius, for your preliminary statement. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, at this point, allow me now to invite Bishop Sipo Tembe, Head of the Electoral Commissions Forum of SADC countries and Vice Chairperson of the Elections and Boundaries Commission of the Kingdom of Eswatini. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director, distinguished leaders and heads of international observer missions present here today. I stand on the protocols as established by the previous speakers. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's already afternoon. Oh, it's still morning. I wanted to feel that everyone is here. You were quiet for quite a long time. Thank you. The Elections Commissions Forum SADC, ECF SADC Observer Mission, comprises of electoral management bodies of the SADC member states. The mandate of ECF SADC is to strengthen cooperation amongst electoral commissions and promote conditions conducive for credible and transparent elections in the SADC region. ECF SADC received an invitation from the Office of the Electoral Commissioner of Mauritius on the 14th of October 2024 to observe the National Assembly elections of the Republic of Mauritius, which was scheduled for the 10th of November 2024. In line with its mandate of strengthening cooperation amongst electoral commissions in the SADC region, the ECF SADC deployed an observer mission for these elections. The ECF SADC election observer mission was led by myself, deputized by Honorable Commissioner Chapotega from the Malawi Electoral Commission. The mission comprised 23 observers from 8 electoral commissions of Angola, Botswana, Democratic Republic of Congo, Eswatini, Lesotho, Malawi, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. The mission commenced its work on the 6th of November 2024 and will remain in the country until the 14th of November 2024. The full preliminary statement will be available to this audience and covers the following: the introduction and background, mandate of the ECF SADC Election Observer Mission, guiding principles, observation methodology, terms of reference, and post-election phase activities. For the purpose of this presentation of release of statements by international observer missions, the summary of which I'm going to present, it shall focus on the preliminary findings, election phase, that is the polling day, lessons learned, and key recommendations. The ECF SADC Observer Mission met with the Electoral Commission of Mauritius on the 8th of November 2024, reason being to assess the preparedness of the Commission to hold credible elections in line with international instruments and principles. The mission's key observation was that the Electoral Commissioner of Mauritius was ready to conduct elections on the 10th of November 2024. The readiness was in terms of its administrative, logistical, and financial capacity to execute its mandate. The Electoral Commission of Mauritius also shared the challenges it faced in the build-up to the upcoming elections, which included the limited capacity to deal with social media and addressing misinformation and disinformation, the rejection of its proposal for same-day counting of votes, and the lack of interest of public officers to be recruited as polling staff. We also conducted consultative meetings with electoral stakeholders, a number of them, on the 8th of November 2024. The stakeholders were drawn from different sectors of society, which included, among others, the legal fraternity, the media, the academia, and the non-state actors. There were key issues that are raised by the stakeholders, positive, and there were also areas of concern. Among the positive aspects, stakeholders raised the following. Generally, a working relationship exists between the electoral stakeholders and the Office of the Electoral Commissioner, a good working relationship. There are proper laws that govern electoral processes. There is a high public trust in the 3 independent institutions entrusted with electoral matters, particularly the Electoral Commissioner as an individual. Regular elections contribute to democracy strengthening in Mauritius. The impressive voter registration turnout. The anticipation by the stakeholders is that the elections will be free and fair. And lastly, among the positive aspects, the existence of funding for political parties. However, there were areas of concern, which were as follows. The writ of elections was issued very late, that is the date of elections, and its negative impacts on the planning and preparations for the elections. The limited involvement of civil society organizations in electoral processes includes a lack of domestic or citizen observation during elections. Decrease in accountability and transparency of public institutions. Lack of platform for dialogue between stakeholders and the Office of the Electoral Commissioner. The limited space for the public and media institutions on access to information and freedom of expression. Concerns on voter inducement and money playing a big role in the conduct of the 2024 elections. Lack of regulation for political party funding. Concerns over the lack of code of conduct for media institutions. The 2024 elections are characterized by the growing use of social media, disinformation, and misinformation. The Office of the Electoral Commissioner is overwhelmed in the discharge of its functions due to understaffing. The inadequate time under the law between declaration of results and filling of petitions challenging results, which is currently 21 days. Concerns on the low representation and participation of marginalized groups in electoral processes. The rejection of the proposal to count ballots at polling stations and automation of the counting process. And lastly, the lack of stakeholders' confidence with the practice of keeping ballot papers overnight and the counting the next day. There were key observations that were made by the mission. Pre-polling phase observations were as follows. The electoral environment was generally peaceful and secure. There was a general high public trust of the Office of the Electoral Commissioner. There could be a possibility of duplication of functions or lack of clarity of roles between the Electoral Supervisory Commission and the Office of the Electoral Commissioner. Based on the mission findings during the pre-assessment mission, which was also led by myself, there seemed to be inadequate voter education. The Office of the Electoral Commissioner has limited capacity to deal with social media, misinformation, and disinformation. The representation of women in political participation stands at 18%. This is an underrepresentation of women given the SADC gender protocol on elections and decision-making positions. The mission also observed that people living with disabilities do not participate as candidates nor recruited as polling staff. The use of public officers as electoral staff is a progressive and commendable arrangement. Lack of domestic observers contributes to a lesser sense of ownership of the electoral processes by the general public. The accreditation process for international observers by the Office of the Electoral Commissioner was meticulously done ahead of elections. A conducive environment existed for campaigning by political parties. Short-term calendar notice affected the election preparedness and stakeholders' confidence in the electoral processes. Late withdrawal by the polling staff affected the election preparedness and stakeholder confidence. Then we come to the election phase, that is yesterday, or the day before yesterday. The mission visited 77 polling stations located in the 20 constituencies of Mauritius, except for one. The observers had the opportunity to observe the opening of polling stations, actual polling, and closing of polling stations. The mission made the following observations on the polling day. Most polling stations visited opened on time, and all the basic opening procedures were followed. There was adequate election material, including ballot papers. The voters or electors register was adequately managed and displayed at all polling stations visited. Electors' number was recorded on the counterfoil upon issuance of ballot papers. Electors were able to cast votes without difficulties, and on average, it took 2 to 3 minutes per vote or per elector to conclude voting. Women were highly represented as polling staff in the polling stations visited. However, youth were not significantly visible as electors at polling stations visited. There were signs identifying polling classrooms or streams, and these were visible in all polling stations. The security personnel present did not interfere with the voting process. And polling stations were laid out in a manner which promoted the secrecy of the ballots and the easy flow of electors. Electors with special needs, including persons with disabilities, were assisted at designated facilities which are called special needs voting rooms. All polling stations were accessible to electors with disabilities, as there were ramps available to wheelchair users. International observers were visible at most polling stations visited, and some polling stations kept a record of observers. Overall, the reception was very much welcoming. Party agents were present and identifiable at most polling stations, and they had copies of the voters or electors register. Most party agents were young people, and proxy voting took place in all polling stations visited. Management of the polling processes at the polling stations was generally efficient and orderly. And lastly, the mission observed polling stations visited closed on time, and procedures were followed in the presence of observers and party agents. Sealed ballot boxes were transported to counting centers for counting processes, which took place the next day. Counting procedures were followed in the presence of party agents and candidates. Provisional results were released at some counting centers ahead of the conclusion of the process. There were lessons learned by the ECF SADC mission, which were as follows. Professionalism of the polling staff in the handling of electoral matters at all levels. A speedy accreditation process facilitates the work of observer missions. The non-sale of alcohol in the 3 days of electoral period, a day before, during voting, and a day after. Lack of regulation for political party funding presents a challenge to the conduct of credible elections. Provision of original stamp on the issued ballot paper enhances accountability. Establishment of special needs voting rooms promotes inclusive elections. Hourly updates of voter turnout at polling stations. The active role played by the Office of the Electoral Commissioner in advocating for same-day counting was commendable. Lastly, the adequate and timeous funding for elections by the government of Mauritius is commendable and highly regarded. The mission had the following key recommendations, which are in two folds. One focused to the Office of the Electoral Commissioner, and the other part is on the legal framework. These ones are directed to the Office of the Electoral Commissioner. Regular stakeholder engagements across all sectors to promote inclusive elections and an atmosphere of confidence between Electoral Commissioner's Office and its stakeholders. Elector education should be strengthened to, amongst others, deal with prohibited conduct such as undue influence on elections. The need to have statistics and strategies to facilitate participation of the marginalized groups, including persons with disability, in the electoral processes. Consideration for adoption of new electoral innovations to complement door-to-door initiatives in elector registration. To strengthen and implement the engagement strategy with electoral stakeholders. And lastly, the need for strategies and initiatives by the Office of the Electoral Commissioner to collaborate with the media platforms in capping the spread of misinformation, disinformation, as well as the growing abuse of social media. Then recommendations on the legal framework are as follows. Develop and introduce a political party funding framework to regulate funding of political parties and candidates. Consider introducing some legislative framework to promote participation of women in electoral matters. Consideration for an independent review of the media regulatory framework to address shortcomings, including adoption of an enforceable media code of conduct. Promote involvement of civil society organizations in electoral matters and domestic election observer missions. Consideration for advance voting as opposed to proxy voting. The advance voting is to be extended to other categories of electors, such as polling staff and other essential services. To consider voting by the Mauritian citizens living abroad, that is diaspora, to promote full participation of all citizens in democratic and developmental processes of the country. Consideration for enacting legislation that establishes an independent electoral management body comprising commissioners and the secretariat, including CEO, responsible for organizing and supervising elections. Consideration for enacting legislation that proposes election dates or the timeous proclamation excuse me, of election date to allow effective implementation of electoral calendar. In line with the best international practice, there is need to consider the same-day counting at polling stations. Consideration for an electoral reform that introduces the use of indelible ink to guard against multiple voting. In conclusion, we came up with the following. The mission congratulates the people of the Republic of Mauritius on the manner in which they conducted themselves during the electoral process. They were able to exercise their democratic right to express their choice. The ECF SADC mission acknowledges the work by the Office of the Electoral Commissioner of Mauritius in preparing and managing the 2024 National Assembly elections, despite the late pronouncement of the election date. The Office of the Electoral Commissioner discharged its duties in a credible manner. Last but one, the mission commends all electoral stakeholders here, including political parties, candidates, the media, for their role in contributing to a peaceful electoral environment. Lastly, the ECF SADC encourages the people of the Republic of Mauritius to remain tolerant, peaceful, whilst the electoral processes move towards conclusion. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop Tembe, Head of Mission of the ECF, for your preliminary statement. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to have a question and answer session. In this session, we are going to allow colleagues from the media and also stakeholders, in case there are some questions that you want to pose to the 4 heads of missions that are present this morning. So we're going to do it like this. We're going to have the first round of questions. We are going to ask you to identify yourself, your name, and also the media organization or the institution that you are representing, and also indicate to us which mission you are directing your question to. Thank you. May we have the first round? Do we have anyone from the media or from the stakeholders who may have a question to the heads of missions present here? Any question or any clarification being sought based on the preliminary statements that have been delivered this morning? It doesn't sound like. Okay, please proceed.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Rudy. I'm from B3, Business Education Workers. So my question is, nearly every one of you spoke about misinformation and disinformation. And one of you even went further in saying that, in mentioning the incapacity of the Office of the Electoral Commission to deal with misinformation and disinformation. My question is twofold. First off is, could you please elaborate on this specific aspect of your convictions? That is, do you have any example? Do you have any one specific example which comes to your mind? And secondly, are you in a position to assess the impact of disinformation and misinformation in the electoral process? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other question? Okay, yeah, proceed.
Jean-Claude Leroy from Maurice Info. You have talked about political founding, participation of women, and since 2014, it's the third time that I'm listening to your report. But we have a government who has I said Jean-Claude Leroy from Maurice Info. And you said that, let's say 10 years ago, but because of a majority situation, either the electoral reform or the political financing went to the parliament, but didn't have the footwaters to get along. So how are you going to tell the new team who won yesterday to implement this recommendation that has been said some 10 years ago?
And that question is to
Everyone, because
okay.
you said about the same thing.
Okay.
Everyone.
Okay. Do we have the last question for this session? Am I seeing a hand somewhere? No. Okay, thank you. Maybe we start with the head of mission of the SADC Electoral Observation Mission, and then if the other heads have got something to say, they will pick it up from the head of mission, SADC Electoral Observation Mission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will attend to the question by Jean-Paul about the recommendations. I think it is quite clear that some of the recommendations, as correctly said, go back to 2014, so we are 10 years behind. Mostly the recommendation leading on same-day counting is polling day, increased participation of women in politics in Mauritius. And I think we identified this preliminary a number of factors that contributed to this. It's a non-progression of reform, at least from our discussion with stakeholders. And one was the lack of a vibrant civil society to be able to assist government to push for electoral reforms. Secondly, lack of political will. But I think it is important in the context of SADC that SADC mission, SADC as an organization, engages with the government on a continuous basis. So the pre-electoral assassination missions engage with the government on this very, very aspect. And I think this is not only in relation to Mauritius, I think it's a bigger question in relation to what extent are recommendations by SADC Electoral Observation Mission being implemented by governments. And I think the Executive Secretary has a role in terms of promoting it. But I think what is important for us really is to draw the attention of heads of state. This report of this SADC mission goes to the President of the United Republic of Tanzania, who chairs this Troika organ, so of Zambia and Malawi, and to take it up again to the heads of state level. It is the heads of state that adopted the principles. So I think some of these which are repeated, in my view, these reforms being implemented, I think the organization of the election could have been better. I think it is correct that there is a lot of manual I'm not saying it is wrong, it is correct manually. You can do manual correction, but some of transparency, some of the time, and so forth and so forth. I think that we appreciate really the laborious work that polling the staff did. I think really they were committed, they were dedicated, some were very experienced, but they admitted it was quite tedious in terms of what they had to feel and so forth. So this kind of improvement, I think, could be done, but there is a constant dialogue. But I think, like in every situation, the momentum also must come from within, and that is for you by the government, and we hope really that this is a continuous engagement, not by only us as observers of SADC, but also some of the other partners that were here with Mauritius to assist in this reform process.
Thank you very much for affording me this chance. Regarding the inclusion of women in the election process or becoming candidates, AU will continue to engage governments or the government of Mauritius to continue to encourage the women so that they become comfortable. Because during our visit to election rooms, election centers, I personally happened to speak to one of the ladies who seemed to be quite active there. And I said, but you are here as an officer. Why is it that you are not part of the team that is ready to be voted? She shrugged her shoulders and said, you know what, this thing is a bit tricky and really wants somebody who can be bold enough to jump to the deep end and start working with the groups that would be. So you can imagine most women are not comfortable enough to participate, but I'm sure with governments and also the involvement of organizations that can be taking women through education, even exposure, and getting to know the importance of them being part of the legislature would also suffice. And regarding the AU, the discussion on the African electoral practices, I'm sure AU is looking into it. There are acts, there are agreements, they have, I'm sure, a procedure that is followed in order to see that those member states are also trying their level best to see to it that what they agreed at that level of the organization is being implemented within their individual settings as countries under the AU. So some of those things, yes, as Africa, we might want to achieve them as fast as we can, but with time, I think once we continue to engage each other as member states, as the organizations expect us to, give our support, one of these days, one of these years, I'm sure we'll be found leading the pack as women because we are in numbers, we have our good numbers on our side.
Thank you. Program Director, may I respond to the issue of misinformation and disinformation?
This is one issue that was common during the pre-observer mission and also during the X1 election process. According to the Office of the Election Commissioner, he doesn't have powers or authority to cap or to control the issue of the media with regards to misinformation and disinformation. And as such, we made our recommendations based on the common SADC practice that if there could be a legal framework in the country that will try to cap this problem of misinformation and disinformation. And we want to encourage the country, the people involved, to take this into consideration. There should be legal frameworks to deal with such issues.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think just to speak to the second one, I hope I've got the name correct. A little bit complicated, the one, I think. The one, yes. I'm getting there. I think just to highlight the role that SADC plays on the recommendations that are made by the respective observer nations. And this you'll find in our guidelines. What happens to these reports? I think as the SADC head of our mission indicated here, they are submitted through our structure and organ structure to the chairperson of the organ. And it's that chairperson that then submits that report based on the gravity of matters that are contained in the report to summit, and for summit to make a determination on those. However, this is the caveat that SADC does not have a carrot and stick process. Ordinarily, and I think the Vice President has also spoken to that, even from the African Union perspective, SADC encourages member states to consider these reports and to use them to make amendments, to make improvements, so that ultimately the electoral process and the democratic process is strengthened. Now, when it takes 10, 15, 20 years, and a matter continues recurring, obviously there will be implications, and it depends on the country itself and the leadership. And I think the key word here is political will for changes to be made. And I think it's important that I need to highlight something here. That observations like we are doing here, these are not for free. These are very expensive undertakings. These are very serious people that you'll find in the top of the table here. Some of them are former heads of state, former judges, former vice presidents, prime ministers. So when they produce the report, they go through this exercise. It's a very rigorous process, a very important process that would encourage governments to seriously consider it and make sure that some of these are actually implemented. And non-action, what does it mean? I think countries and governments have to think about this. Non-action could potentially create other implications for those governments. So the encouragement, I think you're asking the question to the new administration, you just need to encourage and say, these are the reports, and they're very similar in what they produce. So the onus is on them as a new government to consider some of these, especially the ones that have been there for quite some time, to make sure that those are considered for implementation. As has been said, the electoral management body does not have the power. The power sits in Parliament. And if they don't pass, it's the citizens, it's the civil society organizations, the chair, who have to put pressure on the governments of the day make the changes. So I just thought I should just highlight that as a process that SADC follows. On women, we do have a protocol as well. The Vice President has spoken to the protocol that clearly articulates what should happen to the numbers of women. We've signed for this as a member state that I also committed to be tested or assessed at this level that we are going to. So when that doesn't happen, what then do we do? We encourage again, but we hope member states will